Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains live action. What? Oh god, you can see me! Oh god, oh god! My comfort zone has been penetrated. There's no escape for me. Is British Rail here? No? No, not today? Really? Oh. Whew. And today, we're going to discuss 5 more terrible trains. That's the thing that's gonna happen today. I'm just gonna do it facing you, like a real man. 5 more of the worst trains ever. Part 19. No, I don't know how we're here either. There's too many of these. Really, there's too many of these. The R44, early models. The R44s are New York subway models that were built by the St. Louis Car Company from 1971 to 1973, specifically for the B Division and the Staten Island Railway, or SIR. They were meant to replace the R1s through R9 series of cars, and in some regards they were actually very modern. In fact, they had a state-of-the-art electrical and mechanical system. And, you know, state-of-the-art systems can be very good. After all, we want to push the envelope, we want to get things into the future, and the whole point was to modernize the New York subway. So, having a modern system is totally reasonable. What isn't reasonable is that state-of-the-art systems tend to have some growing pains, some things people just aren't used to. And in this case, the big thing seemed to be down to the brakes. It wasn't that the brakes didn't work, it was that the brakes worked too well. The system was very sensitive to a variety of factors, and what tended to happen was that the brakes would lock, thinking there was an emergency. As a result, the cars refused to move. The brakes were stuck like that for an extended amount of time until they could be released. This, of course, disrupted operations, because duh. Additionally, there were some safety concerns with the cars, namely involving the blind. In 1983, organizations for the blind stated that the gaps in between the R44 and R46 cars were dangerous, since the blind could apparently mistake the spaces for doorways. They had to go through a redesign phase. It just had to be done, between the brake systems and everything else going on. So a general overhaul program was initiated, and that seemed to have fixed most of their problems. In fact, some are still in service now with the Staten Island Railway, although they are looking at replacing those someday. For all their issues, they stuck around for decades, and for all intents and purposes, they were fixed. A lot of their problems were growing pains, teething troubles, things that could be and were resolved. So, yeah, they were bad, but they're not like that anymore. At least, they're fine now. The CIE 001 class, sometimes called the A class. These diesels were manufactured by Metropolitan-Vickers at their Dukinfield Works in Manchester, specifically for the Irish State Railways, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. I'm not doing it. You can't make me do anything around here. Look at that. How do you say that? You tell me. If you live outside of Ireland, in fact, I'm convinced even if you live in Ireland, you don't know how to say that properly. There's no way. Diesel electrics, built between 1955 and 1956, they actually served as the backbone of Irish Railways freight operations for many years. But they didn't start out so hot. In fact, they started out absolutely terrible. Just the worst. The reason? Well, they were mechanically very similar to the British Rail Class 28s. Oh yes, the Kobo. The Kobo has appeared on this list before, for various reasons, because they were awful. And in fact, the 001s also had Córas engines too. Those engines really came up when I talked about the Australians X-Class. The Córas engines were just not suited for railway operation. They were notorious for problems, and I assure you, the 001s were no exception to this issue. The engines, for one thing, were unbalanced, and that resulted in vibration-induced fuel pipe and water pipe fractures. The cylinders were often defective, which can lead to a whole plethora of issues, and excessive water temperature caused shutdowns constantly. And it made it so that the 001s, despite the fact that the Irish Railways desperately needed them, were a constant pain, a constant nightmare. Never at any point were they functioning properly, until they did actually fix them. In the case of the Cobos, British Rail just kind of gave up on them and they just didn't use them anymore. In the case of the X-Class, the Australian mechanics actually fiddled with them and constantly repaired all their issues, so they survived a long time that way. Ireland had a different methodology. Well, if the Crosley engines suck so hard, why don't we just get rid of them? A logical maneuver. They replaced them between 1968 and 1971 with EMD 645E engines. Those were insanely good engines. The SD40-2s used engines like these. So replacing the Crosleys with them was a great idea. It didn't go perfectly though, because the cooling systems and transmission systems were left the same, and they weren't suited for EMD's engine. But they fixed that problem by throttling the engine down a little bit. The 645E was meant to operate at 1,650 horsepower, but they dropped that to 1,325 horsepower to deal with the limitations of the cooling and transmission systems. This seems to have fixed the problem, and the diesels kept serving in that form until 1995, which is another impressive display. Much like the R44s, these were really bad, but they were given a second chance and repaired. Out of the 60 that were produced, 4 wound up in preservation. The Tasmanian Government Railway's J-Class. Ooh, we're talking about Tasmania. Is there going to be a devil here? Well, I don't know if you'd call the J-Class a devil. It was actually known as Hagen's patent. But given its particular parameters being a 2640T, yes, it's an articulated tank locomotive. And for that era, for these rails, for the situation, it was truly Big Chungus. Only one was produced in 1901, and it was, frankly, a complete disaster. It was awful. Not because it didn't work, it did, it functioned, but the rails in that time were very lightly built. They weren't exactly the most solid pieces of work. The engines had to be able to compensate for that and not be too hard on them. And this locomotive didn't give a crap about the rails. It destroyed every line it ran on without mercy and without hesitation. It was horrible. Powerful? Sure, yeah, very much so. But truth be told, the rails it ran on felt more force than the cars it pulled ever did. It did survive almost a decade, believe it or not, because they kind of still needed it, even if they had to repair every single rail it ran on during that time. Eventually, it was replaced in 1910 by the K-Class, and the only model of this locomotive ever built was scrapped. The South African Dutton road rail tractors. What in the world did I just say? What is a road rail tractor? What even is that? What am I looking at? Is it a traction engine? Well, sort of? No, not really. That would imply they were good. These are road rail steam tractors that were constructed between 1917 and 1924, and the thought was, let's combine the elements of a rail-based steam engine with a steam tractor. You get the benefits of both and none of the downsides, which is a really nice statement, except that the end result went the opposite direction. They got all the drawbacks and none of the benefits. They were supposed to help the profitability issue of branch lines in the area at the time, but it didn't really go so well, and they weren't just smaller locomotives. That in itself would make them just steam engines. The reason they were called road rail tractors is that while they were stuck on a rail, their driving wheels were actually on road. Like, they used rubber tires and stuff. It was very strange. The brainchild behind the experiment was Major Frank Dutton, SRA signal engineer and motor transport superintendent. He thought that rubber tire in contact with a hard road would be better at transferring tractive power than a steel wheel on a steel rail. That's probably not wrong in some aspects, but it varies very much. And it was found that he was seriously underestimating the tractive effort power of steel on steel, as many people in those days still did somewhat, while overestimating rubber on road. Because rubber on road is decent at traction, but it's not like it's that much better than steel on steel. I mean, there is a difference, but it wasn't enough to warrant a complete redo of the whole network. At the end of the day, the whole system seemed rather pointless. For one thing, putting it on rails denied the freedom obtained by rubber on road. and it wasn't like it was such attractive effort improvement over the traditional rail network to warrant it. Also, it was a lot slower, too. They last ran in 1927, and every single one of them wound up scrapped. The SLVS Motor Car. Welcome to the San Luis Valley Railway, where they decided to make their own locomotive when they were by no means qualified to do so, and they decided on some really weird decision-making processes. Much like with the railroad tractors, they thought, you know, what if we made some of the wheels on this locomotive rubber? And they did. They put rubber tires on this thing between the sets of freight car trucks, specifically to increase traction, and they had a Ford flathead V8 engine that powered the thing. Needless to say, I should probably stress this is very important to me, this didn't work at all. The rubber tires kept busting open. They weren't built for the weight or the conditions involved with rail operation. The whole thing was sidelined as a switcher, which it kind of was able to do, and then it was finally taken apart. The railroad was reorganized in 1953, and by 1957 they were reduced to just a few miles in the Blanca area, but they weren't done trying to create their own locomotive. This time they made something called the D500. Instead of using rubber, they didn't do that again, they used a chain. Like on a bike? What? What are you doing? It feels like every design choice they made was counterintuitive to how anybody else was making locomotives. And I don't mind doing things differently. I love the element, I love the spirit here, but it worked better than the rubber, won't lie. This one was powered by an International Harvester UD24 diesel engine, which drove a Caterpillar hydraulic transmission, which fed into a Euclid truck axle. What? The truck axle was connected to a sprocket, and that turned a double roller chain, which was reduced down to another sprocket that went down onto one of the trucks. The main drive chain drove the wheel, with said wheel also chain driving the wheel on the adjacent truck. What? Why? Everything I just said is way more complicated than it really had to be, but admittedly it did work. Maintenance was not fun on it because there were so many moving parts involved with keeping this system operating, but when it was working, it did work. They got some use out of this weird locomotive. In 1996, they shut down, and the equipment basically sat abandoned. The assets were eventually purchased by the San Luis and Rio Grande Railway in 2007, just to use for car storage, and the two remaining SSLV locomotives were left to rust. In fact, based on my research, it's still there. The D500 is anyway, just chilling. It's not considered preserved since no one seems to be interested in moving it or putting it anywhere, but I would almost encourage, as weird as it is, I would almost encourage someone to look into possibly preserving it, because it's such a unique piece. Like, I can't think of any other locomotive ever in the history of, well, railroading in general, to ever be laid out in such a perplexing way, and for it to actually kind of work. The one before it, that used the rubber tires, is long gone, but this chain system is apparently still there, so I'd be interested to at least see it, and put it in a place where it doesn't just rust into nothingness. But you'd have to get someone with enough money, and means, and space in order to do that, and I live in a 2-bedroom apartment, so it's not going to be me. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Tribal Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fucks, Dime Blade 17, Anzac A1, Dozzy Wazit, and Tommy Rossini. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.